agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Carson.
Hey, good morning, Mike.
Hey, Jay, how you doing this morning?
Well, as the First Lady might say, I'm as unique as a Glenlivet and boiled haggis.
Ooh, very, very nice. I like that one. Well, as usual, we have an awful lot to talk about. You know, it's strange. Every Monday or Tuesday, or sometimes even by Wednesday, I think, geez, I don't know what we're going to have to talk about. And then sure enough, the world provides, unfortunately or not, more than enough material for us. And this week, we're going to be talking about some Biden administration abortion guidance and Texas's lawsuit about that, the news about the inflation and the economy, some update, I guess, sort of on COVID, and Joe Manchin. Joe Manchin's going to come into the conversation, I'm sure, because, well, yeah, he will. The Brittney Greiner trial, and maybe some more stuff, depending on how much time we have. But there is a lot to talk about, and we are going to be getting to that starting in just 1 second. Okay, Jay, so we open with the latest in the Biden administration's efforts to provide women with access to abortion services in the wake of the Dobbs decision and the, ever more restrictive and now constitutional state abortion bans. On Monday, July 11th, Secretary of Health and Human Services Xavier Becerra emailed a guidance letter to healthcare providers across the country concerning something called the Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act, or EMTALA, I guess you'd pronounce it. This is a federal law that was enacted by Congress in 1986 that requires Medicare participating hospitals to provide stabilizing medical treatment to patients. And as Secretary Becerra put it in the guidance memo, if a physician believes that a pregnant patient presenting at an emergency department, including certain labor and delivery departments, is experiencing an emergency medical condition as defined by EMTALA, and that abortion is the stabilizing treatment necessary to resolve that condition, the physician must provide that treatment. And when a state law prohibits abortion and does not include an exception for the life and health of the pregnant person, or draws the exception more narrowly than EMTALA's emergency medical condition definition, that state law is preempted. And as for, what constitutes an emergency medical condition under the legislation, well, the statute includes placing the health of the individual, or with respect to a pregnant woman, the health of the woman or her unborn child, in serious jeopardy, as well as serious impairments to bodily functions. And the Secretary also reminded physicians that this law provides them legal protection if an abortion performed based on these considerations violates state law or hospital policies. And he reminded providers that penalties for violating EMTALA include civil monetary penalties and may also include exclusion from Medicare. And I should point out that's an important component, is that this only applies to hospitals that or providers that accept Medicare, which is pretty much, everyone. So, and Texas, in response, brought suit against the federal government, with the state's attorney general arguing that this guidance, or so-called guidance, he would say, is an attempt by the administration to, in the words of the suit, use federal law to transform every emergency room in the country into a walk-in abortion clinic, and that EMTALA does not and never has given the federal government the authority to compel healthcare providers to provide abortions. Now, the case will first be heard by Judge James Hendricks, who's a Trump appointee, and if there's going to be any sort of appeal of a decision or an injunction, it would go to the Fifth Circuit, which is generally considered to be the most conservative federal appeals court. So that's kind of the background on this. Jay, what are your initial thoughts on all of this, of which I'm sure we'll be coming back to when we hear rulings along the way?
So my initial thoughts, this goes back to what we've said a couple times in the last couple of weeks, and quoting Justice Scalia, is that Congress does not hide elephants in mouse holes. And Secretary Becerra seems to be saying that Congress has hidden the elephant of abortion legalization in the mouse hole of the EMTALA.
Can you explain that?
don't.
I don't because here's I guess what I'm struggling to understand about that. I kind of thought that might be your response, but EMTALA specifically refers to abortions, and it also lists specific guidelines about what an emergency medical condition is. So it seems to me nothing's being hidden here. The legislation specifically references abortion several times, and so how is this hiding anything?
Well, I mean, I guess to the extent that it does provide an actual saying abortion, then I would suppose it does not. That changes the equation a little bit, and then you get into the federal preemption question. And again, I don't know where that one lands, if you will. My concern would be that the way the guidance is written, there seems to be an awful lot of discretion that is afforded to the physician and then consequently to the Department of Health and Human Services to make these decisions. And that to me seems to be sort of a backdoor to try to undo state laws that have been duly passed.
Except
and I'm not positive that the federal government has the authority to do that.
Well, except this couldn't be an attempt to undo because this legislation was passed in 1986, right? I mean, this is 30 some years ago. And also, I mean, there are some pretty clear restrictions definitional restrictions on what constitutes both an emergency medical condition and what constitutes stabilizing. And so, I mean,
right. And I was going to mention that statute did include the more limited health language, right? The impair substantial bodily function.
Right. And that kind of reminded me of our conversation last week when you said, well, if there's no specific definition of this, then it could be like, oh, well, someone could experience emotional distress. And that's,
Yeah. And this does have the tighter definition. So I think there's less concern there. The piece that I guess maybe troubled me the most in the guidance, and you can pull up the letter because you sent me the letter and I read it myself, is the line where Secretary Becerra says the process is complaint driven.
Right. Well, that would make sense, right? I mean, because if there's no way to know if there's a violation unless someone makes a complaint, right? So
Sure. Well, no, it's a true statement, obviously. But reminding that the process is complaint driven. There's a little bit of more than a little bit of an implicit threat there.
Can you explain that to me? I'm not sure exactly.
Because here's the thing: you don't. If you go and you complain, who are you going to complain to?
Well, the federal government.
Yes, Secretary
HHS.
Becerra.
Yeah, HHS. Yeah.
And Becerra, I believe, would be receptive to your complaint.
As I would hope any administration official would be if there's an allegation that federal law is being violated.
Well, I would say if there's an allegation that federal law is being violated and there are facts to substantiate that federal law is being violated.
Of course. Yeah, absolutely.
And my concern would be there is essentially a chilling effect, if you will, right? That there is, listen, if a complaint's brought against you, that may in fact be game over, right?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, that's assuming a system that's already reached certain conclusions and will not be fair and impartial.
That's what I'm assuming.
Well, if so, I guess the problem here. Let me stop you there, Jay. Let me stop you there. If we're
state policies, right? I mean, that would be my.
If we're assuming that the federal government will not act in good faith in adjudicating these cases, then what's the point of any of this? If you say you have so little faith in the federal government, I mean, so then why don't we just do away with the federal government and let Texas be its own country? I mean, really, that's not a good argument.
If you wanted to say let's do away with the federal government being in charge of these administrative proceedings, which will determine
who would be in charge of them. I mean, this is the federal law. Well, the courts, of course, will come into this. Certainly. I mean, they already are. But I mean, there's a clear statute that was written 30-something years ago that is on point and applies. And the secretary is just saying, hey, there's this statute. And of course, you don't have to follow it. But if you are a Medicare recipient, this was part of the deal. This is not some new thing. This is just something that we're reminding you of. And also, I should point out that, the vast majority of abortions are actually not done under anything approaching emergency conditions.
Oh, agreed. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, it's tough to get good data on this, but like over 90% of abortions, from the best data I could find, are non-emergency. And, you mentioned chilling effect, and I agree. That's of course the argument that a lot of providers are concerned about with a lot of these state laws, saying, hey, what if, there's this state, in most states, all states, as far as I'm aware, have an exception for life of the mother. But the concern is, well, how long do I have to wait? Do I have to wait so long where it's incontrovertible that the mother might die, and therefore that could lead to more deaths? And so that would have a chilling effect in the other way, is what the proponents of reproductive choice are concerned about, and I think rightly so.
Right. But those are two different statutes, two different problems, right?
Sure.
I'd agree there can be a chilling effect either way.
Yeah.
But if you're asking me, what do I think about the guidance letter? I think that's a chilling effect in terms of, let's say, first of all, again, I understand how Texas sees this as a walk-in abortion on demand, right? Because
can you explain that to me? Because I don't see that.
How do you police something like this, right? Someone, let's say someone comes in for an abortion. Let's say they are not that far along, right? But the abortion would still violate Texas law. Let's suppose they're brought in by someone who is an abortion activist, and they say, "Listen, a physician who we would assume performs abortions or routinely did perform abortions. This person needs an abortion for her health or to preserve substantial bodily function." What will that doctor say?
That doctor would,
in my sense, he would say, "I agree."
No, not at all. I fundamentally disagree with you on that. I think the doctor would say, well, let me take a look at the patient. I think any doctor would say that, and assuming otherwise, I think is just really kind of doing a disservice to the doctors in general. And so I disagree with that. I think doctors, there are certainly shady doctors like there are shady attorneys and shady politicians, plenty of those.
Yes.
But I think the vast majority of physicians, especially emergency, well, not especially, but, and this is the case of emergency physicians.
Emergency departments. That's something different too. Yeah.
But this is specifically focused on these conditions. So in other words, you can't come in to a regular hospital and just, non-emergency and just say, oh, I'm pregnant, I'd like an abortion, and, oh, this is an emergency. And it's like the doctor's going to say, oh, yes, okay, I'm just going to accept that it is, and I will abort your fetus. That's not how this would work in the real world. It's just wrong. And that's why I think Texas's contention is just incredibly wrong, hyperbolic, statement. And I get why they're making it, because Texas being Texas, they do everything big in Texas, including, big untruths. And this is one of those.
So I'd be interested in learning more on how emergency department is defined, either by the statute or in Texas law or in both. And that's something I frankly did not get in the preparation to do, because I think that would be significant. Right?
Explain what you mean.
Well, again, if you have someone who is again, not in the typical ER that you're thinking of, right? When you and I say emergency department, we figure that is the place at the hospital, or sometimes standalone, associated with a hospital, where you go in, where you whatever have you're having chest pains, or you just sprained your ankle or whatever, but you need immediate attention. if that definition could be broadly applied.
Well, no, it's a very specific definition.
And I guess that's my question.
The term hospital includes a critical access hospital as defined in Section 1395X of this title, and a rural emergency hospital as defined in Section 1395X, second section of this title. So, I mean, these definitions.
Convincing me. I'm getting more comfortable with this then.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess what I'm saying here is that this is certainly. I can understand how somebody who is a pro-life activist would read the guidance letter as a very heavy-handed threat. I agree with you. I get that. Now,
I'm not a pro-life activist, but that's why I read it.
Yeah, but even more so a pro-life activist. But upon thinking about reading the actual legislation as well as the letter, like you did, it seems to me that this is something that certainly will have some effects on the margin, but I don't think is any sort of drastic or any sort of federal overreach at all. And I don't even think the preemption question is really a question in that, I mean, we all know that Congress could, well, not we all know, but most people would agree that Congress could essentially pass legislation that would put in place all sorts of rules on abortion for Medicaid participating hospitals, and that would preempt state law there. And of course, the states would be free to say, well, we're just simply not going to accept Medicaid. Now, I think there's another argument saying that, well, could Congress find some other sort of interstate commerce type of justification for doing that? And they could. That would be a little more, I think, constitutionally questionable, though still, I think, well within a safe zone.
No, I think there's an argument there.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's more of an argument than it is for Medicaid participating hospitals, is what I'm saying.
I think the spending power argument is easier to make and win than the Commerce Clause argument. Even
before the Fifth Circuit. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That said, I don't know that the spending power argument is a slam dunk, right? I guess I'd need to think about that some more.
Yeah. No, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, it seems to me that, well,
can the federal government, through its spending, compel actions that would violate a state's criminal law?
Well,
I think that's a live question.
Well, yeah, I see.
Issue. I think that's look. I think it's a good argument, and I think there's a strong likelihood. If I were a betting man, I would say that the spending power preemption argument would win. I'm saying it's not a slam dunk.
No, yeah, I agree. I think it would win narrowly. I would expect that if I would expect that if this case in particular came to the Supreme Court, it would probably be like, I would guess, something like a 5-4-6-3 in favor of the administration, ruling being, but yeah, definitely not. I wouldn't expect this to be any sort of unanimous thing. Justice Thomas would pull something interesting out of his hat, and Sam Alito would sign on to it because that's what they do. And anyway, but yeah. So yeah, there is a related thing I wanted to get into as well and ask you about. And that is that also this last week, the Biden administration issued guidance to retail pharmacies telling them...
Can I throw in one last...
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
So, but I just want to make sure my point is understood about the point of noting the complaint-driven process.
Okay, yeah, right? we kind of dropped that a little bit. So
to me, how I read that is, we'll be watching you.
See, I read that just the opposite.
In the real world, it's not a matter even so much of, hey, look, the federal government investigated me and brought charges against me, but I was exonerated. Once the federal government brings charges against you, you're done, as a practical matter.
Always.
I would say typically, yeah.
And there's a difference. Like this. There's a difference, right? Between
how would your employer respond if they found out that the federal government is investigating you for something or other?
Well, let's make some distinctions here, Jay. There's a distinction between investigating and then bringing charges and then being convicted of those charges. And all those things. Now, I don't imagine you're saying that the federal government should not investigate reasonable allegations that federal law is being violated. You're not suggesting that.
Not at all.
Okay. So I guess I'm struggling to understand what you're suggesting, because it seems to me that complaint-driven process is just the opposite. If it's we're watching you, that would be, well, this is going to be a regulatory, a sort of, we're going to be on site, we're going to station agents in all these emergency rooms. That would be we're watching you.
There's always understand. I guess let me put it this way: the China's Cultural Revolution.
Oh God!
Was a complaint-driven process.
Oh, are you really going to make this? You're going to really?
Yes.
Oh, you're not going to make a China analogy.
I'm saying this is how if there are activists out there who will make the complaint. And
what else
the
would
complaint
drive
is made? That has a substantial chilling effect.
What else would drive the process? I guess. I'm struggling to understand how the process would work if somebody did not file a complaint. How else could this process work?
I agree. That's how the process would work. But I'm saying Becerra's reminding people of that. His use of how that the phrasing in the letter.
I see. Okay.
Is what's heavy-handed.
I see. Just reminding people of their rights under the law is very heavy-handed.
Well, it's not reminding people of their rights under the law, right? It's reminding physicians that, if someone complains about you, we're going to be on it. Whether that complaint's valid
as I would expect they would. I mean, I would hope that if I complained to the federal government and had a reasonable allegation that law was being violated, that they would be on it.
Let me do a hypothetical real quick.
Okay.
Let's say President Trump had rightfully won the 2020 election.
Okay.
And he is now the president, and it is now Trump's Secretary of HHS who is in there. And there is a federal law that says something to the effect of you shall not provide abortions under certain circumstances. It's an HHH regulation. And this is a complaint-driven process. Would you not consider that to be a chilling effect, or wouldn't physicians feel that to be a chilling effect? That if someone complains about them, they're going to be in the government's crosshairs. And would you have the faith that a Trump HHS would not be so politicized as to essentially make the investigation the conclusion?
Well, those are two separate questions. And I guess as to the first one, I see your point. The letter could have gone out and would have had the same practical effect if that complaint-driven process phrase hadn't been used. And so, I see what you're saying, and I agree.
The left, thrives on cancel culture. That's their weapon.
Well, let's hold. Can you see? I was with you, and then you had to take it one step further. That's
okay.
So let's back up to the point where I was actually with you before you head off into cancel culture. I think you're right that this was. I think we're just maybe using different terminology. You see it as a chilling effect, and I see it as just a reminder of the law, and that the federal law cannot be, that if you attempt to subvert federal law, there may in fact be consequences. You see that as chilling and negative, and I see that as kind of more or less neutral. But I get where you're coming from on that, certainly.
Okay.
So it's not that I don't understand you on that. So, okay.
All right.
Now, the other thing I wanted to mention, kind of related to this, right, is the Biden administration also issued guidance to the pharmacies across the country saying, hey, you can't refuse to fill prescriptions for abortion pills or any other drugs that you think, as a pharmacist, may be used off-label to end a pregnancy. And the administration here argues that pharmacies that receive federal funding, which is basically any pharmacy that has Medicare, so all the pharmacies, right, that this would be, in fact, a violation of federal civil rights laws treating pregnant people or based on pregnancy conditions, from what I understand. We talked about this in a way, sort of, I thought, last week. Right. And I mentioned just over half of all abortions are medical and not surgical. So this is kind of a big deal. And Jay, you mentioned last time women seeking an abortion could presumably just kind of connect with an out-of-state telehealth provider, get a prescription and terminate their pregnancy. And under this guidance, well, they could get that out-of-state prescription and just take it to their local, whatever, Walgreens or CVS in any state, and that would make it much easier for them to do. And I guess presumably a state could ban all out-of-state telehealth services, but it couldn't do it just for, certain type. In other words, it seems to me like this is a pretty big, I won't use the term loophole, doesn't seem correct, but it seems to me that this guidance isn't unreasonable, but I wanted to get your take on it.
I guess I again, what troubles me most about this, about both of these actions, right, is the sense of instead of saying, listen, the court has said this goes to the states, let's fight this out in the states. It seems to be an attempt to use federal law to reverse that outcome or to ignore that outcome.
But federal law preempts state law.
To resist,
right?
Yeah,
and
no, I
so
understand.
If there are federal laws on the books that require certain
instances,
things, and so I don't think this is, I mean, like we talked about before, Congress could pass legislation that would, really liberalize, could give kind of the entire country, say California or I don't know, Massachusetts' rules on abortion. And so to me, this isn't a question of trying to, of Congress or the administration doing anything that's outside of the law. They're just using pre-existing federal laws to attempt to preserve the rights of women that are enshrined in federal law, at least, if not the Constitution after the Dobbs decision, to access to abortion services. And I guess you see that, I don't think you disagree with me so much, but you see that as a much more ominous sort of thing, maybe.
I do. I think that's more the way I'm looking at it is one, this is an attempt to use sort of agency authority to legislate undercover, right? And I don't know, as far as the law, as far as what a pharmacist's duty is, if they think a drug would be used for something other than what it's being prescribed for, right?
Right.
I can tell you that there were plenty of pharmacy chains and pharmacists who have been charged in the opioid crisis. And recently, some of them have paid billions of dollars, even though what they would tell you is, look, we were just filling these prescriptions that were written for patients by licensed doctors.
Now, they have reporting requirements in some instances, and I think a lot of those lawsuits were about when you see unusual volume of certain controlled substances, you need to report this, and in many cases, they just did not. They did not do that.
Sure, but I guess that's my issue is if we are going to say, what is going to be the responsibility of pharmacists? Is it look, you got a prescription, I don't care what you do with it. If that's the rule, then I guess okay.
Right, I see what you're saying.
But that ought to be the rule sort of across the board.
Absolutely. And I feel like I have a pretty consistent.
Now, how about this?
Okay.
What about if a state puts in a rule saying, listen, pharmacists, we'd like you to track all of the abortifacient drugs that you dispense. Let us know how many you're doing, and please report back if there's someone who is a doctor who is prescribing a whole lot of these.
I would expect that as long as it didn't violate HIPAA or any other patient privacy.
No, you wouldn't have to name the patient.
Yeah,
right?
I would expect that would be perfectly okay. Yeah.
Here is a doctor who I'm trying to think some of the other treatments that some of these drugs can be used for.
Yeah.
But let's say, he prescribes these abortifacient drugs all the time for this, non-abortion related condition. We'd like to keep track of that.
I would expect that would be entirely within the state's purvie. I mean, I might not like it.
Okay.
But yeah.
That's first question. Yeah. Would it be legal? And I would agree. I think it probably would be. Would you see that as intrusive? And
oh, sure. I mean, that's the state's all about being intrusive, for better or worse, right? I mean, that's what the state does. That's what regulation is designed to intrude, to prevent or compel certain behaviors, So, yeah, absolutely. And, I was going to say, I feel like I have a pretty strong record and a consistent record of being against the administrative state exceeding its statutory authority or its constitutional authority to do things. And it's just in these, even when it's kind of against my policy interests, right?
Right. And I hate to see you blow the record. That's why
I think in these cases, I don't think I'm being inconsistent. I just, having read the legislation, I feel like this is well within their legal purview, and it's not even really, for me, that much of a gray area. So I'm not just, basically what I'm saying is I'm not just arguing backwards from my preferred policy position here, which is something.
I get that. Yeah.
So yeah. Any other thoughts on this before we move on to our next thing?
No, let's move on.
Okay, let's move on. All right, so moving on, let's talk a little bit about inflation. Of course, recent report continued to rise in June, according to the CPI report released late this week by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The month-to-month increase from May was 1%, with the sort of headline 12-month rate being 9.1%, which is, I'm sure everyone knows, the highest in 40-plus years. BLS characterized this increase as broad-based, with gasoline, shelter, and food being the largest contributors. Gas prices are up nearly, at least from last month, nearly 60% from a year ago, and food is up 10.4%. Now, there may be some relief on the horizon as gas prices across the country have actually gone down from those levels we saw in June. But on the other hand, there's Russia's continuing war in Ukraine and its effects on food and energy availability, as well as the rise of COVID BA.5 and that potential effect on supply chains, especially if China ends up mandating another widespread lockdown, as China has been wont to do. And the Federal Reserve, they're scheduled to meet later this month. It was clear already that they were going to raise rates by 0.75 of a point, but now it's seen as possible that rate hike might actually be as much as a full percentage point. So, Jay, what do you take away from this? What do you make of this?
Well, I mean, I don't know what else to say other than I told you so. It's going to take a while for this inflation to get wrung out of the economy, and some of the best things we can do right now are stop pumping. Don't pump more money into the economy. And let this ride out and hope for a soft landing. I don't know that it's going to be a soft landing. My guess is that next month we'll find out that we've been in a recession. So there it is. I'm not sure. What. It's inflation is in some ways it's kind of a disease of once you've gotten it, right, you kind of have to ride it out. It's not just something that you can turn around overnight, especially when it's related to things that are relating to international supplies and demand.
Yeah, well, I would say it's tricky, right? I think a lot of people, maybe some people, maybe not a lot of our listeners, but I know some people have this idea that, well, the Fed lowers interest rates, the prime rate, and things kind of snap into place. But there's been a lot of research on this, and there's a considerable lag between the Fed lowering rates and those sort of having a broader effect in the economy, which makes sense if you think about it, because we have a consumer spending driven economy, and so it takes time, and we're talking like a year or more in many cases. And so not only do you deal with that enormous lag, you also deal with the fact that the Fed is working with lagging indicators, right? And so this is a really sort of tricky thing. And that's why back when the Fed and a lot of other people, not Jay, but a lot of other people thought that this was potentially a transitory sort of thing, the Fed didn't want to crank up interest rates and potentially cause, a unnecessary slowdown of the economy a year from then to deal with a problem that might have actually gone away on its own. So it's a tough thing to do, which is why the Fed is oftentimes so conservative, I guess I would say, in taking any sort of action at all, really, in many cases.
You should have listened, Jerome.
Well, and again, I think there was good reason for people to think that some of this was transitory, in part, for two things. Number one, I don't think anyone, well, not anyone, but there were a lot of people who know a lot about this stuff who I think are surprised at the incredible persistence and mutability and variability of COVID, right? We had original COVID, then all of a sudden we're hit with Delta and then Omicron and its variants. And, this has been a very unpredictable sort of thing, right? And so that's hard to estimate. And then, of course, there's Russia's disastrous war in Ukraine. And you add all that stuff together and the environment is just incredibly uncertain, I think. And that's what makes it even harder to act in sort of any sort of a rational, calculated way.
So I'm going to throw out, and this is my just general conservative bit about why we shouldn't blindly trust experts or always trust experts, is that the experts seem so often to be surprised. They were shocked and surprised in 2008 by the Great Recession. They were shocked by the internet bubble bursting. Now they're shocked and surprised by inflation. All these very smart people who assured us that it's transitory, who were telling us, oh, look, you idiots, you don't understand modern monetary policy. We can keep pumping money into the economy indefinitely. And to some extent, COVID, if anything, I would say delayed inflation, right? Part of the inflation was the comeback from COVID.
Yeah.
That all of a sudden now we have, all kinds of money that's been pumped into the economy, both from fiscal policy and monetary policy. And second, we've got this pent-up demand. And third, we've got nowhere for it to go.
Because of supply chain problems.
To me, that was sort of entirely predictable, as was the war in Russia.
Well,
right?
hold on.
We're talking about the war in Russia a year before it happened.
Well, let me back up. I think, once again, I agree with you to a point when then I got off the train and you went on to the next stop. So
all right. Here's
the point to which I agree with you. I think it's absolutely important to recognize, and enough people don't recognize, that the world is an insanely complex place. And if you take even the advice and the predictions of experts as gospel truth, you are oftentimes going to be disappointed in part or in whole. Just because even the smartest people in the world, we're talking about an enormously complex system. And I also agree that experts oftentimes overestimate the extent of their expertise, their ability to predict the future. There's actually been some interesting work done on how good experts are at predicting these things, and not all that great. So yes, absolutely. But that's where you and I agree. But then all of a sudden you went off into, and if people just would have listened to me, because this was common sense. Exactly. And I'm like, well, wait a second here.
I'm not saying that you should have listened to me, but I'm saying
it sounded that way.
From where I sit, right, from just a common sense standpoint.
Well, let's talk about what common sense means.
From a basic economics 101 standpoint.
See, this is where I get off the train, because it seems like you're making an argument that all of these people don't understand basic economics, and if we just used common sense, I think that's even a worse error. See, I think you're overcorrecting. It's one thing to say, hey, we need to have a bit of caution before blindly acting and throwing all of our, eggs in one basket based on expert consensus. Absolutely. But it's another thing to say, hey, we should just do what seems to make sense on the surface because non-expert opinion is better than expert opinion. That's just not the case.
No.
The case is, let me finish. The case is that. Let me phrase
it this way.
Okay.
Let me phrase it this way. When the expert opinion seems to be blatantly counterintuitive, it ought to come in for particular scrutiny.
Absolutely. But I don't think that was the case
here. In this case, we had a situation where the government had for some time been printing money hand over fist, and increased that even more so in the pandemic. Also, we had a situation where the government started giving all sorts of cash aid, and then also not only cash aid, but then deferrals on student loans, deferrals on rent, all these other policy actions that put more cash into the economy. And you can say, listen, that was justified at the time. It was an emergency and so forth. The government then pumped even more money into the economy. And all the while, the experts are saying, well, no, I don't see inflation coming back. To me, the very intuitive, response, and this is sort of a look. I'm not saying experts are know nothings, or you just got to go with what the common man on the street says, who may not know anything. But I'm saying you don't need a weatherman to tell which way the wind blows.
Well, let me. I see what you're saying. When the wind is blowing
one direction, and the experts say, no, don't worry about it. I think there ought to be particular scrutiny of those experts.
Well, let's talk about what we mean by experts, I guess, because this idea that everyone said this is just not the case. It's absolutely the case.
I'm thinking Jerome Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve.
Well, let me again.
He's an expert.
Yes, he is an expert. But the idea that
Paul Krugman.
Yes. What about Larry Summers? Would you say he's an expert?
I would.
Okay, and I'm sure that Larry Summers was voiced significant concerns with all of this and has been for years, right?
Yeah, he was in the substantial minority.
Okay, now would you say
also,
that? Let me finish here. Let me finish.
Yeah, he's also the disgraced Larry Summers. But
yeah,
go ahead.
Let me finish. So, would you say that there are economic experts at the American Enterprise Institute?
Absolutely.
And at the Cato Foundation.
That's where the good ones are, Mike.
And at the Heritage Foundation, right?
Yes.
So what I'm saying is that there were a significant number of economists who happen to not control the levers of the economy because they're from the party not in power, who voiced concerns. There were plenty of members of Congress who said, hey, I think we are spending too much. Now, as you pointed out, there were political realities. And at the time, it seemed like, well, we need to do everything we can to keep people kind of whole and safe physically. And if there's inflation, well, let's hope that doesn't happen. So what I'm saying is that I guess I'm defending, I'm saying that expert opinion, such as it is, was not monolithic, was not uniform on this. And it turned out that, yes, the experts, I would say, who would, broadly speaking, represent the right or conservative, Larry Summers is not exactly a man of the right, but more conservative policy economically, have been proven right on this. And that doesn't include Jerome Powell, for instance, and other folks that you mentioned. But that does not necessarily mean, I think you alluded to that at the time that was a horrific decision because, again, we're in the midst of a crisis and what do you do to make sure that people can remain whole without physically endangering themselves, right? And so,
but it's also at different points in the crisis, right?
Sure.
I think I'm pretty much on record saying, look, what we did in March and April of 2020 was justified. What we were doing in January of 2021, less so. Proposals that are floating now, even more less so.
Absolutely. And I think and there are certainly disagreements as to the extent to which federal spending has contributed to this, but the best data I've been able to find, and it suggests that, there were the U.S. response, which was much more, I might say generous, you might say profligate, whatever, than in many other rich countries, has actually contributed to more problems down the line in terms of inflation, certainly. Now, again, that's not the only concern. But yeah, looking back, I would say it would have been better if we had, especially later on, spent less, right? So, yeah. And I think this is obviously, as you mentioned, I think modern monetary theory. I think certainly this has been a blow to that sort of belief system if you will.
You'd hope.
Yeah.
You'd hope it.
Well, there are always.
I don't know.
There are people who, believe in all kinds of, crazy fictions, modern monetary theory, free markets, all that kind of stuff. But, they kind of take it too far and, they are blinded by their own ideology. But, and my concern is that a lot of these things are not just, are kind of structural things, right? I mean, we don't know how long COVID's going to go on for, but it has a scary ability to mutate. And these supply chain issues could stretch on for a while yet. And I think, when you look at the leading factors in this inflation, right? Okay, the gas price is going down. Maybe that helps. And I think that is going to help out a whole lot, actually. And
yeah, that has an effect on other prices.
Yeah, especially since there was so much the leading thing. And so I would expect to see that level. I would be surprised, not that I'm an expert, but I would be surprised if that level wasn't actually lower next month. But even so, that aside, when you're dealing with, for instance, the two other issues, food and shelter, right? Well, with food, we know that the Russia-Ukraine thing is not going anywhere. And that is a major factor. And not only that, but we have climate issues that are causing droughts and other conditions. And as more and more people are interested or are wealthier and are interested in having more animal product heavy diets, that obviously contributes to that because animal feed and so forth require more resources. And so you get kind of a contraction in supply compared to demand. And there's also the housing element when we know that ever since the 2008 crisis, we've had a major housing shortage in this because, of course, a bunch of builders who did too much ended up going out of business. And we are severely underbuilt, especially in that kind of affordable housing level. And that's not the sort of thing that just, corrects itself immediately. So we're dealing with some pretty important longer-term structural factors that I'm concerned we're not doing enough to address if we really want to deal with this issue of, too much money chasing too few goods, right? We want to be able to fix that. And I'm concerned that we're not doing enough on those lines. I don't know what your take is on that.
Yeah, no, I think you just kind of made the argument for supply side economics, but
well, I don't know that I did that, but that's maybe another conversation. So yeah. All right. Well, before we move on to the supporters exclusive segment of the show, I just want to remind everyone quickly that if you are not listening to When Do People Decide, that podcast, you're really missing out. Last week I was mowing the lawn. I listened to this great story about Katie Faye's a regular person, not rich, not politically corrected in Michigan. She was really bummed out at gerrymandering in her state. And she said, well, why don't we change that? And she started this grassroots campaign, led to a ballot initiative, resulted in Michigan actually moving to an independent redistricting commission. It's a really interesting story. And Jenna and the folks over at When Do People Decide do a great job of telling it in a compelling way. And so definitely check it out if you haven't already. It's When Do People Decide, and you can find it, wherever you get the politics guys, I guess. So there you go. And so, yeah, we are going to be moving on to our Patreon supporter segment. But before we do, just a reminder that if you would like to get all of this stuff and ad-free and all that, well, you can become a Patreon supporter. Just go to patreon.com/politicsguys, or you can support us through Venmo or at politicsguys, as well as through PayPal. All those support links are in the show notes and at politicsguys.com/support. But if you'd like free access to full episodes, you're not in a position to be able to support us financially, we totally get it. Just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will take care of that for you. Be happy to do that. And whether you're a supporter or not, it really does help us if you can subscribe, rate the show, leave reviews on whatever podcast app you happen to be using, and share episodes on social media. Thanks so much.